A sunny afternoon in a quiet neighborhood seemed like any other day for 9-year-old Maya. She was outside, running around in the park, her laughter filling the air as she played with her friends. The park was a place she always felt safe, far from the worries of the world. But this day was different. As Maya and her friends were finishing their game, a police car slowly rolled up to the park. The officers, two men in their early 30s, got out of the car. Maya didn't think anything of it at first, assuming they were there for a routine patrol. She was used to seeing police officers around her neighborhood, but they had never paid her much attention before. That would all change in an instant. One of the officers walked over to Maya. Without saying a word, he grabbed her by the arm. Maya froze, her heart racing in confusion. "Hey, what are you doing?" she asked, trying to pull away from his grip. She was scared, not understanding why the officer was touching her. The officer, clearly irritated by her resistance, told her to stop moving. Maya didn't know what was happening, but something felt wrong. The officer's grip was too tight, his face too serious. He started pulling her toward the police car, making no effort to explain. Maya's friends shouted out, asking what was going on, but they too were dismissed with a simple command to move back. It all felt like a bad dream. As she was led toward the car, Maya began to panic. She knew that if she said something, it might make the situation worse. She could feel her chest tightening, her breathing shallow, but she tried to stay calm. In her young mind, the idea that an adult could be acting so aggressively toward her seemed impossible. But there she was, struggling against an officer who refused to listen. The other officer, the one who had been standing by, didn't speak a word. He seemed to watch the whole situation unfold with a detached expression, as if it was just another routine arrest. No one seemed to care that Maya was only a child. No one seemed to care that she was confused and scared. They just kept walking, guiding her to the back of the squad car. Maya was small, her body only 9 years old, and yet these grown men handled her as if she were a criminal. She tried to look for her mom or someone else who might be able to help, but the park was too far from her house, and the officers blocked her view of anyone who might intervene. Her heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. Maya didn't know what was happening, but she had the sickening feeling that something wasn't right. And as she was pushed into the car, the officers continued to say nothing, leaving her alone in the back seat, trying to make sense of it all. This moment, simple to any other adult, would mark the beginning of a journey that would change her life forever. Little did Maya know that this arrest, this moment of misunderstanding, would become the center of a larger story, a story that would touch many lives and force everyone to take a deeper look at the way things were done. The situation quickly escalated. As Maya sat in the back of the police car, still trying to understand why she had been arrested, the sound of sirens filled the air, signaling more officers arriving on the scene. Her stomach twisted in knots. She was too young to fully grasp why this was happening to her, but everything about the moment felt wrong. The car was cold, and the silence inside was suffocating. She wanted to scream for her mom, but the words wouldn't come. She felt completely alone. Outside the car, more people had gathered. Some had started to film the scene with their phones, capturing the moment that no one could have predicted. A few onlookers were visibly upset, asking the officers what was going on, but they were told to stay back. Maya's friends, still in shock, were also standing near the crowd, their faces filled with confusion and concern. One of the officers in the squad car finally spoke, his voice cold. He radioed for backup and told the other officer that they needed to take Maya to the station. The decision to take such a drastic step was baffling to anyone watching. Maya was a child. What could she possibly have done wrong? Yet the officers acted as though this was just another routine call. Their lack of empathy or consideration for Maya's age and emotional state made the situation even worse. In the distance, Maya's friends could hear whispers of disbelief. Some tried to approach the officers, asking them to explain what was going on. But the officers were firm, ordering everyone to step back. They didn't make any attempt to explain their actions to the crowd, and that only added to the growing tension. Maya's friends started to cry, unsure of what would happen next. They had never seen anything like this before. It was as though the world had suddenly turned upside down for them. As the officers took Maya to the station, they seemed oblivious to the fact that their behavior was causing a stir. It wasn't just that they had arrested a child. It was the way they were handling the situation, with such little care and respect. It was clear to anyone who saw what was happening that Maya was terrified, yet no one stopped to ask her what was going on, or if she was okay. The officers remained indifferent, pushing her forward with a sense of authority, but no understanding. The drive to the station felt like hours to Maya, though it was only a short distance. Her mind was racing. Why were they doing this? Why couldn't anyone explain it to her? As the car slowed to a stop at the station, Maya glanced out the window, hoping to see a familiar face. Maybe her mom would be there, or someone who could tell her that everything would be okay. But when the doors to the police car opened, she was met with nothing but the cold, clinical atmosphere of the station. There was no relief in sight, no sense of comfort, just the sound of the officers' footsteps echoing in the hallway as they escorted her inside. Maya's heart sank as she realized how alone she truly was. The world she knew had shifted in an instant, and she didn't know how to make sense of it all. Unbeknownst to Maya, though, the story of her arrest was about to take a shocking turn. The discovery that would follow would change everything and expose a deeper layer of truth that no one could have anticipated. Inside the police station, the air was cold and sterile, with the harsh fluorescent lights overhead casting a clinical glow on everything. Maya sat on a hard bench, her hands clenched in her lap. She tried to stay calm, but her heart raced with fear. She couldn't stop thinking about her mom. Where was she? Why hadn't anyone come for her yet? Everything felt strange and distant, like she was trapped in a dream she couldn't wake up from. As she sat there, waiting for someone to explain what was going on, the officers who had brought her in stood nearby, talking in low voices. They barely looked at her, as if she were just another case to handle. Maya felt a wave of sadness wash over her. She was only 9, but in that moment, she felt small and insignificant. It was as though no one cared that she was just a child. After what seemed like forever, the door to the holding area opened, and another officer stepped inside. He was older, with graying hair and a stern expression. Maya looked up, her heart lifting slightly. Maybe this officer would understand. But as he approached, his gaze was cold, and he didn't speak to her. He simply glanced over the paperwork that had been filed earlier and then turned to the 2 officers who had arrested Maya. The air grew thicker with tension. The officers exchanged a few words, but Maya couldn't hear them clearly. Then, the older officer turned back to her. He didn't soften his tone, but there was something different in his eyes. He spoke directly to her for the first time, asking her name and where she lived. Maya answered quietly, unsure of what he was trying to do. She didn't know what he wanted or why she was still here. Outside the holding area, Maya's mom, Teresa, had arrived. She had rushed to the station as soon as she'd heard what had happened. Her heart was in a panic as she pushed through the doors, demanding to see her daughter. The officers, still standing near the door, blocked her path. But when they realized who she was, one of them quickly stepped aside. "Ma'am, you'll need to calm down," the officer said, though his tone lacked any real concern. Teresa didn't care. She was frantic, desperate to see her daughter. "Where is she? Why is my daughter here?" Teresa asked, her voice shaky but strong with determination. The officer seemed reluctant to answer at first, but after a moment, he finally led her down a hallway and into the small, dimly lit room where Maya sat. When Teresa saw her daughter, sitting alone on the bench, her heart broke. Maya looked so small, so frightened, that Teresa's own eyes filled with tears. She rushed to her side, wrapping her arms around her daughter in a tight hug. "Maya, what happened? Why are you here?" Teresa asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Maya, unable to hold back any longer, started to cry. She told her mom everything she could remember, the officers grabbing her, taking her away, and how confused and scared she felt. Teresa held her tighter, trying to comfort her, but there was no hiding the shock and disbelief in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, baby," Teresa whispered. "We're going to figure this out, I promise." But just as she said this, a new voice interrupted. The door to the room opened again, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Teresa froze for a moment as she recognized the person walking through the door. It was Captain John Mitchell, the head of the local police department. He had always been a well-known figure in the community, respected for his leadership. But now, standing in front of them, he looked different, his face pale, his expression full of regret. He looked directly at Maya, and then at Teresa, his voice low and sincere. "I'm so sorry for what's happened. I had no idea this was going on." "Maya is my daughter," Captain Mitchell said. Teresa and Maya both stared at him in disbelief. Maya's confusion deepened. What did he mean, his daughter? Could it be true? Could the police captain really be her father? The revelation was staggering, and it was clear that the arrest wasn't just an ordinary mistake. It had become something much more complicated. The tension in the room thickened as the reality of the situation began to settle in. The captain's presence was both a source of comfort and confusion. What would happen now? Teresa and Maya sat in stunned silence as Captain John Mitchell stood before them, his presence heavy in the room. It took a few moments for the words he had spoken to fully sink in. Maya's young mind was racing, still trying to process everything that had happened. Her father, the police captain, was the one in charge of the very officers who had arrested her. How could that be? Why didn't anyone recognize her or know who she was? Why hadn't they treated her differently, especially knowing her father's position? Teresa, still holding Maya close, looked up at the captain with a mix of confusion and anger. Her eyes searched his face, looking for some sign that he understood how deeply his daughter had been affected by this. She couldn't make sense of it. How could he, someone who was supposed to uphold justice, allow something like this to happen to his own child? I don't understand," Teresa said, her voice shaky but determined. "Why didn't you stop them? Why did they treat her like that?" Captain Mitchell's face tightened as he let out a long breath. He clearly struggled with the situation, his professional demeanor crumbling under the weight of what had happened. "I didn't know," he said quietly, his voice thick with regret. "I didn't know they were arresting Maya until it was already done. I was in a meeting at the time." Maya, still in shock, looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with questions. "But why did they do it? I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her small voice barely above a whisper. The captain glanced at her, his face softening for a moment, but the weight of his own actions seemed to hang over him. He sat down across from them, taking a deep breath, as if he was searching for the right words. "I'm not sure why they acted the way they did, but I promise you, this will be looked into. They should never have treated you like that, Maya. You didn't deserve any of this." As Maya listened to him, she still didn't fully understand why the situation had gotten out of hand. All she knew was that she had been scared and confused, and now, sitting here, hearing her father speak, it didn't make her feel any better. The damage had been done. The fear she had felt while in the back of that squad car was something she would never forget. Teresa, her mind racing with thoughts, stood up and started pacing. "This is wrong, John. This isn't just about Maya. This is about what happened to her, how she was treated by your officers. Someone needs to answer for this." Her voice wavered, but the anger in it was unmistakable. Captain Mitchell nodded slowly. I know. I will take full responsibility for this," he said. He seemed sincere, but his words didn't offer much comfort. The reality of what had occurred was too overwhelming to simply be swept away with an apology. "Just taking responsibility won't fix this," Teresa said firmly, standing her ground. "Maya has been traumatized by this. She may not show it now, but this experience will stick with her. She's only 9, John. 9 years old, and your officers treated her like she was some criminal." There was a long silence as the captain absorbed her words. He looked at his daughter, guilt clearly written on his face. He had spent his career serving as a protector of the law, a man respected in the community. But now he was faced with the bitter truth that his own officers had wronged his daughter. He could already hear the whispers and the judgment that would come, not just from the community, but from within his own department. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was a problem that ran deeper. "I'll make sure this is investigated properly," Captain Mitchell said, his voice firming as he stood up. "I'll make sure it's handled, and that the officers who are responsible for this will face consequences. No one should be above accountability, not even my own people." Theresa, though still hurt, seemed to find a small measure of comfort in his words. She nodded, but her expression remained wary. "I want real action, John, not just words." The captain nodded in agreement, knowing that he had to do more than just promise. He had to show, through his actions, that he was truly committed to making things right. But he also knew that this situation was far from over. The truth was just beginning to unfold, and the ripple effects of this incident would reach further than anyone could predict. The days that followed Maya's arrest were filled with a whirlwind of emotions and confusion. Captain Mitchell kept his promise, and an internal investigation was launched into the actions of the officers involved. However, the road ahead was anything but smooth. The situation, which had started as an unfortunate mistake, was quickly turning into a full-blown controversy. It was catching the attention of the public and the media. Theresa, still deeply shaken by the events, spent the next few days focusing on her daughter. Maya was quiet, withdrawn, and seemed to avoid talking about what had happened. She didn't understand why this had happened to her, and every time she thought about it, her heart filled with fear all over again. Theresa knew that the emotional scars from that day wouldn't be healed easily. She tried to reassure her daughter, but the damage had been done. Maya was too young to process the weight of everything that had happened. Meanwhile, news of the arrests spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with opinions, and news outlets were covering the story from every angle. People were outraged by what they saw as a clear case of racial profiling. But it wasn't just the community who was speaking out. There were calls for accountability from all sides. Civil rights organizations were calling for the police department to be held responsible for what had happened to Maya. Activists were using the incident to highlight the ongoing issues of police misconduct and racial discrimination. Captain Mitchell, who had once been a figure of authority and respect, found himself at the center of the storm. His position as the head of the police department made him a target of criticism. He knew that his credibility, both as a leader and a father, was on the line. The very officers he had trained and worked with were now under suspicion for treating his daughter in such an inhumane manner. It was a humiliating and painful realization. In response to the growing outrage, Captain Mitchell called for a public press conference. He knew that the situation demanded transparency and a clear plan of action. As the day of the press conference approached, the pressure weighed heavily on him. He had to address the public's concerns, restore faith in the police department, and most importantly, make things right for his daughter. On the day of the press conference, Captain Mitchell stood in front of the gathered reporters, his face stoic but weary. The room was filled with flashing cameras and murmurs of anticipation. He took a deep breath before stepping up to the podium, knowing that what he said next would set the tone for everything that followed. "My name is Captain John Mitchell," he began, his voice calm but heavy with emotion. "I stand here today, not just as a police officer, but as a father. I want to address the incident that occurred with my daughter, Maya, and the officers involved in her arrest." He paused, gathering his thoughts. What happened to my daughter should never have happened. She was treated with disrespect, and no one, especially a child, should ever have to experience what she did. As a father, I am heartbroken by the events that unfolded, and as a police officer, I am deeply ashamed. The room was silent as everyone waited for his next words. "I've already launched an internal investigation into the officers involved, and I promise you that there will be consequences for their actions. Captain Mitchell continued. This situation has shown a light on issues within our department that need to be addressed, and I am committed to making real changes. We will work toward building trust with our community, and we will ensure that something like this never happens again. Although his words were strong, Captain Mitchell knew that action spoke louder than anything he could say. The investigation was just the beginning. And now, more than ever, he needed to follow through on his promise to make things right. Meanwhile, Maya and Theresa were at home, watching the press conference unfold on their television. Theresa held Maya close, knowing that the road ahead would be difficult for them both. The events of that day had changed everything. Maya would need time to heal, but the work to fix what had been broken would require more than just words. It would take real change, not just in the police department, but in the hearts and minds of the people watching. And that, Captain Mitchell knew, was just the beginning. The aftermath of Maya's arrest continued to ripple through the community, and the public outcry grew louder with each passing day. News outlets and social media were buzzing, with people from all walks of life sharing their thoughts on the incident. It wasn't just local news anymore. This story had reached national attention. The arrest of a 9-year-old girl by police officers, particularly one that involved such a young child, was something the world couldn't ignore. People were talking about it everywhere, from dinner tables to town halls, demanding justice and change. Maya's mother, Theresa, had to balance her personal distress with the public attention that was being thrust upon their lives. She could no longer walk down the street without someone recognizing her or stopping her to offer their support. The community had rallied behind her and her daughter, but it was also hard to escape the constant reminder of what had happened. People wanted answers, and they wanted them quickly. And Theresa knew she had to be strong, not just for herself, but for Maya, who was still trying to understand why everything had turned upside down. Maya, though surrounded by love, remained quiet. She didn't want to talk about what had happened. Every time she thought about it, she felt a sense of unease, like the world had suddenly become a place she couldn't trust. School, once a safe and familiar place for her, now seemed like another place where things were out of her control. The kids at school asked her about it, some in curiosity, others in confusion. She hated having to explain. She didn't have the words to make sense of it. And even if she did, she didn't know if she wanted to share her feelings with others. Every time the conversation turned toward the incident, Maya shut down, retreating into herself. But Theresa was determined to help her daughter heal. She knew that Maya needed to feel safe again, to feel like a child once more, free from the worry and fear that had taken hold of her. They spent quiet afternoons at home, reading books together, or going on short walks through the neighborhood. Slowly, Theresa saw glimpses of her old Maya, the girl who loved to laugh, the girl who still dreamed big. It gave Theresa hope that one day, Maya would be able to move past this and reclaim her innocence, even though the road ahead was uncertain. Meanwhile, Captain Mitchell was under constant pressure. The media was relentless, and the department's internal investigation into his officers' actions was moving at a rapid pace. He knew that the public's trust in him, and in the police department as a whole, was hanging by a thread. For years, he had worked hard to build that trust, to be seen as a fair and just leader. But now, he was fighting to restore not just his own reputation, but the credibility of the entire force. The investigation into the officers was progressing, but Mitchell knew that it wasn't just about punishing those responsible. It was about fixing what was broken within the department. Captain Mitchell held a private meeting with his team, including the officers involved in the arrest. He was no longer the respected leader he had once been in their eyes. The shame he felt was visible, and as he sat across from the officers, there was no room for excuses. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he quietly but firmly told them how deeply disappointed he was in their actions. "I never thought I would have to have this conversation with you," Captain Mitchell said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I trusted you. I believed in the values we stand for. But what happened to that young girl, my daughter, was wrong. We failed. And now we need to make it right. The officers were silent, some of them shifting uncomfortably in their seats. There was no denying the gravity of the situation. The captain's words stung, and they knew that the consequences of their actions were far-reaching. They had been part of something that could not simply be overlooked or swept under the rug. And though some of them felt guilty, others sat in quiet disbelief, unsure of how it had all gone so terribly wrong. Captain Mitchell's leadership was now being tested in ways he had never imagined. He was forced to make tough decisions, decisions that would determine not just the future of his department, but his own future as well. He knew that the community's trust was something that could take years to rebuild, and that the path ahead would be filled with difficult choices. For Maya and her family, the road to healing had only just begun. The investigation continued, and Maya's story remained a focal point for the entire town. But as the days went by, one thing became clear: change was coming. The question now was whether the changes would be enough to heal the wounds that had been inflicted, both on Maya and on the community. The hope was that, in time, the damage would be repaired, but only time would tell. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of the situation began to feel even heavier for Captain Mitchell. The pressure from the community, the media, and his own department was becoming unbearable. He had promised to hold his officers accountable, and now the time had come for him to face the consequences of their actions. But more than that, he had to confront the fact that his entire career, his integrity as a leader, was now on the line. The man who had once been seen as a symbol of authority was now questioned by many, including his own officers. The investigation into the arrest of Maya was making slow progress. The department had begun interviews with the officers involved, as well as any potential witnesses who could shed light on what had transpired that day. However, even as the investigation advanced, it was clear that the situation was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. There were different versions of events, and much of it depended on who was telling the story. The officers involved claimed they had acted in what they believed was the best interest of the situation, but their actions didn't match their words. Maya was still just a child, and the excessive force used against her could not be justified, no matter how much they tried to explain it away. Captain Mitchell spent his days in meetings with his superiors, trying to keep the situation from spiraling further out of control. The department had been shaken to its core, and the eyes of the public were upon them. The captain couldn't help but think about how this could have been avoided if only his officers had exercised better judgment. He had spent years building a reputation for fairness and professionalism, but now it felt as though everything he had worked for was slipping away. He had failed his daughter, and in doing so, he had failed the community he had sworn to protect. At home, things weren't any easier. Theresa, though grateful for the community's support, still struggled to help Maya through the trauma of that day. Maya wasn't speaking much anymore, and when she did, it was often just a few words at a time. The excitement she had once had for school and playing with her friends had disappeared, replaced by a sense of unease and weariness. Theresa knew her daughter needed time to heal, but it was hard to watch her suffer in silence. She had seen the way the arrest had affected Maya, and it tore her apart to know that her little girl had been so unfairly treated. Maya's silence was a reflection of the deep emotional scars that the incident had left. Theresa tried her best to encourage her to talk, to express how she felt, but Maya simply couldn't find the words. She had been betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect her. How could she explain that feeling? How could she describe the fear she had felt sitting alone in the back of that squad car, wondering if anyone would come to help her? Maya's confusion was still so raw, and even the thought of speaking about it made her shut down. She had become quieter, more reserved, and it broke Theresa's heart. One day, while they were sitting together at home, Theresa gently asked Maya, "Do you want to talk about it, sweetie? About what happened that day?" Maya looked up at her mother, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and confusion. "I don't know," she said softly. I don't know why they did that to me, Mom. I didn't do anything. Theresa hugged her tightly. I know, baby. I know. And I'll make sure that no one forgets what happened to you. We're going to make sure things change. But even as she said this, Theresa wasn't sure how much change would come. The public pressure was mounting, and the investigation was nowhere near finished. Would the officers face real consequences, or would the system protect them, as it so often had before? Captain Mitchell's public promise to make things right had been important, but Theresa had learned by now that promises were only as good as the actions that followed them. In the quiet moments at home, Theresa found herself wondering whether the captain's efforts would be enough to restore the trust that had been broken, not only between his department and Maya, but also between the police and the community. The incident had shown how fragile that trust could be. It had exposed deep cracks in the system, cracks that couldn't be ignored or swept away. The question now was whether Captain Mitchell would be able to fix what had been broken, whether he could rebuild the department and regain the faith of his daughter, his community, and himself. Time was running out. The public was demanding answers, and the investigation was nearing its end. The next steps would be crucial, not only for the police department, but also for Maya's future. Would the truth be enough to make things right, or would it all be too late to heal the wounds that had been opened? As the days continued to pass, the tension in the town seemed to grow thicker. Captain Mitchell's promise to make things right was still hanging in the air, but everyone was waiting for him to follow through. The public was watching closely, and the media had not let up. Headlines remained focused on Maya's arrest, and the story became a focal point for a larger discussion about police accountability and racial discrimination. But for Captain Mitchell, the investigation had become more than just a matter of fixing his department's image. It had become a test of his integrity as a father and as a police officer. He knew that he couldn't undo what had happened to Maya, but he was determined to make sure that nothing like it ever happened again. Behind closed doors, the officers who had been involved in the arrest were facing the consequences of their actions. The internal investigation had not been an easy process. They had each been questioned, their every word carefully examined, and the department's leadership had been under intense scrutiny. Some of the officers showed genuine remorse, acknowledging their mistakes, while others remained defensive, struggling to admit the wrongness of their actions. The captain had to make difficult decisions. He couldn't afford to let this situation slide, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. He had to show the community, and more importantly, Maya, that the department was committed to change. Meanwhile, Maya was slowly starting to open up, though the process was long and fragile. Her mother, Theresa, was doing everything she could to support her. They spent more time together, talking about the future, about school, and about what Maya loved. Slowly, her interest in her hobbies returned. She began to play with her friends again, though she still carried the weight of what had happened. But with each passing day, Maya started to feel a little more like herself. The scars from that day would take time to heal, but she knew she had a loving mother by her side, and that made all the difference. The public demand for justice was unwavering, and the town was divided. Some wanted immediate action, calling for those involved in the arrest to be removed from their positions, while others believed in allowing the system to run its course. In a town like this, where everyone knew everyone else, the debate wasn't just about the arrest. It was about trust. Trust in the police, in the community, and in the justice system. The conversation that had begun as a simple tragedy had now expanded into a larger conversation about how to prevent such things from happening again. People were questioning what needed to change and how to make sure that children, especially children like Maya, were treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. Captain Mitchell knew that even after the internal investigation was complete, the work would not be done. The department had to rebuild, and it had to do so with a clear commitment to fairness and respect. He understood now that leadership was not just about managing a department. It was about fostering a culture that put the safety and well-being of the community first. His leadership would have to change if he was going to regain the trust he had lost. The outcome of the investigation was soon announced. The officers involved in Maya's arrest faced disciplinary action, though the details of the consequences were kept private for legal reasons. While some felt that the punishment was too lenient, others believed that it was a step in the right direction. But the biggest change came in the form of a public commitment from Captain Mitchell. He vowed to implement new training programs for his officers, focusing on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. He also promised to work closely with community leaders to ensure that every citizen, especially children, felt safe and respected. For Maya, this news was a small but meaningful step toward healing. While she didn't fully understand the complexities of the situation, she felt a sense of relief that the people responsible for what had happened were being held accountable. It wasn't a magic fix, but it was a start. As time went on, the town began to heal. It wouldn't happen overnight, but the conversations that had been sparked by Maya's arrest had started to make a difference. People began to listen more, to understand more, and to demand better for their children. Maya's story became a symbol of the need for change, not just in the police department, but in society as a whole. Captain Mitchell knew that he still had a long way to go, both as a father and a leader, but he was committed to doing better. Maya and Theresa's journey was far from over, but with each new day, they were moving closer to healing. The road ahead would be challenging, but the lessons learned from that dark day would guide them forward, toward a future where trust, respect, and understanding